Hi, everyone, and thank you, Marta. Thank you, everyone here at Spitzer, all of the faculty and the students for having us. It's really an honor to kick off the lecture series this semester. It's really cool, and I feel really just honored and privileged to also bring these other three colleagues here into this space. So thank you guys for joining. And I'm going to now share my screen. All righty. Thanks again, Marta, and thank you, Curry and Jennifer and Emanuel for joining me. I really hope that this can be part of restarting a culture here at Spitzer. We're gathering for these lectures. We're still doing that in a kind of strange hybrid way, but I know that there are many students downstairs in the auditorium and up here in studio. I now have sympathy for folks who give talks right after studio finishes, because it's quite an interesting experience. But yeah, so we really I hope and we hope that today is a bit of a window into some conversations that myself and these three other colleagues have been having around this idea of Blackness and the land, and kind of reassociating ourselves with land and territory and what that means. This is the first one of these conversations that we are having. And so it's a little bit of an experiment. We're trying something out. We're gonna each kind of share 5 slides in hopefully 5 minutes after a short kind of contextualization. But we hope to have more of these, and also maybe have more of these conversations with other people in our network. I know there are many even faculty here at Spitzer who are working on similar issues. So we by no means are claiming to be the only ones working on this, on these ideas. And I think this ties well into this kind of larger theme of the advanced studios that I'm coordinating here, where we're looking at this idea of territory. And I think that, that brings up these kind of structural questions, structural implications. And so I'm just kind of giving a shout out and making that connection that I think, in many different ways, we're being asked to kind of redefine the territory of our discipline, the territory of practice, and that territory, that substrate upon which the built environment disciplines sort of articulate themselves is suspect. And I think that's part of what we're kind of engaging when we start to think about the kind of legacy and history of Black, but also a kind of intersectional subjectivity and landscape and territory. So as I was saying, we came together, and this is just a little bit of a kind of contextualization slides here, really kind of loosely and intentionally to unpack and celebrate how the history of Blackness, and like I was saying, you can extend that really to a kind of diaspora or intersectional brownness, indigeneity, or otherness, really like offers and unlocks a possible new imaginary that I think is particularly urgent today as we're kind of engaged in a reckoning around issues of land and landedness, but also experiencing a kind of land grab that we've been witnessing in the last several months. And so that's this new imaginary that might be unlocked through the lens of Blackness and how we might think about architecture, might think about space, and the articulation of a subjectivity and a built environment, both before and after capital P property. And I know folks like Emanuel are very interested in this. And thinking through that history and legacy and how Black and brown people have moved through the land. So movement through the land, migration through the land, but also this struggle to survive and keep and steward the land. How that might offer clues to a forward-thinking practice, right, into a kind of futurity. And then really just asking ourselves, like, what could a Black land practice be? What does that look like, right? And so, these, as Marta was saying, this is important for our teaching as well as our practice. and these ideas kind of have aesthetic, political, pedagogical implications. The politics of Blackness and liberation, I think, have implications or proposed implications on how we might teach these built environment disciplines. And so this is just an array of some of the diversity of courses that we're teaching either now or have recently taught, the four of us, and the kind of different lenses, different entry points into this conversation that we will elaborate on. And again, this kind of, I think to tie it to the theme maybe of this entire lecture series, that to consider the kind of Black American relationship to land and property as a sort of subversive one to a kind of late capitalist infrastructure. And again, how that struggle to sort of survive and maintain and steward the land introduces the kind of new idea of commons, which I know I'll touch on in my 5 slides. Oh, and then so this is just again, and then in both teaching, but also in our practices, I wanted to just quickly show a few images of our respective practices and give a shout out to our collaborators. So ideas like I was saying of the kind of lot and the sort of urban framework in some projects that we've done in our studio, Jerome Haferd. And then we'll see some of the work of Curry in his teaching and practice. Looking, I thought I would just give a shout out to his work with the Diaspora project and a kind of engagement with the landscape. And also a project like the Beautiful Browns House that actually was a collaboration between Wayside Studio and my office. And then this sort of almost rurality and spaciousness practice that we sort of see in Jennifer and Tom's practice, Dream the Combine. This is some work of theirs that I just thought to bring to the table in case that she doesn't include it in her slides. But again, kind of thinking through these problems in different ways through our respective design work. And then finally, looking at how these issues of land sort of intersect not only the rural territory, but other kind of urban and suburban configurations, and also diasporic configurations. So the work of ADWO and Emanuel and Jen, his partner. So again, we're not all looking at this in the same way. And to the previous slide, a kind of Black land pedagogy doesn't have to mean rural necessarily. However, we did sort of, and I was intrigued in some initial kind of reaching out to these 3 others in the context of this larger geographic and continental conversation around the sort of migration of peoples and that sort of reassociation with the landscape, and how the 4 of us, and there you could bring others into this, represent a kind of maybe sub-selection of BIPOC practitioners and academics looking at this larger territory of the United States. And in this case, our respective, even our relationship to our respective geographic territories, and how that actually, in this case, tracks along this sort of greater Appalachian mountain range. So you can see I just put dots there that kind of represent, in this case, the 4 of us and a sort of geographic relationship to that territory, and how that even might begin to be a substrate to link some of our conversations and how we might be teaching and how we might be thinking about these issues at the continental scale. So Jennifer, now having been doing work in the Midwest and Minnesota and upstate, and now now in Ithaca, myself in New York City in the Hudson Valley, but looking very intently at Appalachia, Emanuel in New York, but also looking a lot at Atlanta and the whole Atlantic Ridge, and then Curry kind of charting a practice from rural Virginia, but now kind of between DC and Knoxville, Tennessee, where I think he is right now. So this is just a kind of geographic context. And again, this territory, this kind of continental territory, the Appalachian Mountains and the southern United States, has this legacy of a territory that has sort of been host to these kind of migrations and fugitivities, dispossessions that refuse, that also is a host to multiple legacies of territory or landedness that refuses a kind of easy categorization towards modern and relationship to these modern ideas of urbanization or fixed settlement, racial hegemony. Indeed, you know, this kind of, there are territories in the Appalachian Mountains, for instance, that's kind of touching to some of my research that are persistently described as a kind of no man's land, a zone of fugitivity, hiding, and of liberation, actually, and outsidership, that I think are just words to kind of put into here. And of course, against the larger backdrop of the sort of Great Migration, but you know, even kind of predating that, what Du Bois and others describe as the Great Dispossession, which if we go to the next slide, yes, is really important to understand that this kind of relationship to land and landscape and how that relationship has been sort of severed and traumatized for many peoples in many different ways, but kind of in this context through this sort of this migration to the urban centers as a kind of survival tactic, which then results in this kind of dispossession of land that millions and millions of acres were kind of under the stewardship of Black and Brown people in the aftermath of Reconstruction that I know Emanuel has kind of thought about a lot in the Reconstructions group. So what does it mean to reassociate ourselves with the land, develop practices of the built environment that seek to redress and liberate, and even offer other ways of engaging with land and territory? We're about to discuss that a little bit, or we are discussing that. And like I said, of course, there are many other folks working on these ideas. I just brought a couple images of networks that we are involved in. Dark Matter University, a great group of practitioners and academics there. And of course, as I just mentioned, groups like the BRC, the Black Reconstruction Collective, Emanuel is one of them, who are very much engaged in this conversation. Okay, so now we're going to just ping pong it a little bit and hopefully have time to ask each other questions, maybe take a couple questions from the audience. This is really meant to just be a kind of quick session of 5 slides, 5 minutes, kind of talking about what Black land practice means for the 4 of us. I will start. Did you guys have anything to add to what I just said?
No, man, you got it. This is great.
That was the intro?
Yeah. All right.
All right, yes. See, I cheated, Emanuel. That was the intro.
The intro.
And now I get my 5 slides on top of that. Okay. So I just grabbed, you know, a few images. This is some images of Harlem and some of the work of our practice branch, Knapp and I's practice, beginning in, which really is in many ways centered around this Black landscape. So thinking about a kind of practice of Black landscape, in particular Marcus Garvey Park in Harlem, and how that might point towards a Black land practice. So kind of, you know, looking at that transition. And what, you know, began in our practice as a deep engagement with this sort of micro territory of Harlem, which has its own wildness and its own fugitive topography of the Acropolis here in Marcus Garvey Park. And then a kind of decade-long sort of stakeholdership in this territory, which then becoming aware of the presence of the erased Harlem African burial ground, and starting to kind of take an interest in an archaeology of Black erasure and an erasure of an agrarian commons and Lenape trails that are the sort of legacy of this immediate territory that predate the Manhattan Grid. And so then an interest in how these sites, and this is another African burial ground site up here in the Hudson Valley in in the Pine Street neighborhood of Kingston. And these sites and their erasure and efforts towards memorialization and redress challenge our disciplinary tools. We don't really have a language to talk about slavery, as Walter Hood said here at Spitzer 3 years ago. And so, that's actually an interesting opportunity to think differently about design, to think differently about what we're architecting, which became the interest here in some of the studios I taught for here and elsewhere. And so what does then a reparative urbanism look like, or a living memorial infrastructure? This requires a kind of radical imagining. This demands structural thinking about the transformations of the urban conditions that surround the project, as well as the sort of site itself. And that kind of necessitates thinking beyond the singular lot, right? So this is an image of one of the student projects by Nicholas Losi in the Pine Street studio that I taught here a couple years ago, where again, this was framed. The studio is both historically looking, but also very much a speculative process, a generative process to, in this case, kind of imagine a different kind of archival infrastructure that is transcending the kind of politics of singular ownership of this territory. And so kind of tracking some of that right around the same time as the studio in the office, where we were working on a competition for rethinking accessibility and housing. But we kind of, we're also thinking about these structural questions of territory that kind of undergird the architectural object. So this project called Side by Side by our office, we sort of positioned the house within this larger urban commons. And the concept of the project really takes these three lots as the sort of architecture, and kind of broke the singular lot relationship and conceives of them as one single territory. So the design here is as much of this double or triple house and a kind of model of stewardship, but also an architecting of a breakage of the parcel logic. That is this sort of logic of the kind of late of capitalism, and thinking how a kind of, again, an urban imaginary might come. And then I just brought this image from a different set of exercises from some of the studios, which are kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum, which is from the sort of abstract or kind of structural, and also beginning to try to associate ourselves with a land practice that is maybe more embodied or subjective, or embodied or subjective. So this was an ancestral practice exercise attempting to sort of reassociate different forms of making and landscape. And then I'll just end here with again, this kind of looking towards the Appalachian Mountain territory, which is this territory that our studio Restoring the Potomac is now engaging ourselves with.
In our practice, we're really fascinated with language, both how the words we use and the spaces we construct can make meaning. So I wrote the title of our gathering this way because ostensibly we're talking about being Black in land, that Black is a subset or part of a larger denominator. But really in the United States, at least, these two units are reciprocal. The United States as a country was not able to come into being without our presence, our labor, our creativity, our resilience, our kin, our blood, and the pre-existing nation states of indigenous people who were and still are here. So there's no uniform story unfettered by the tangled legacies of land taking and genocide, body taking and enslavement that were part of our founding. So we can enter into this topic through so many currents, through legal structures to talk about Black land, through capital and economies, through social relationship, and through memory. It is the last of these that has perhaps shaped my thinking the most, as I'm neither a lawyer like my father, nor a social scientist. I'm an architect and an artist who tells stories through material. So I want to linger on how Blackness and Land together participate in the spatial imaginary, how it is a network space rather than one place, how it is actually an expression of time, and how we are continually searching for the words, the material, and the form with which to speak to it. Now, Jerome showed a little snippet from a syllabus of a course that I taught at both the GSD and also at University of Minnesota called Movements. And this image is on the front page of that syllabus, and it's kind of an entry point. And I'm going to show a few images that just maybe talk about ways to find this language around Black land. This image is from a beautiful series of photographs by Dawood Bey called Night Coming Tenderly Black, which was commissioned for the Front International in Cleveland in 2017 and is now held by the National Gallery of Art. And in these images, he's showing a series of sites, some known, some inferred, and some perhaps imagined around Cleveland and Hudson, Ohio, that were part of the Underground Railroad. Depicting these labored flights to freedom becomes a process of site archaeology, site mythology, and site seeing through the darkness of land, moving far beyond what we architects might call site analysis. The slide I show here was actually lightened by Bey specifically for distribution, whereas the actual images are very, very dark, like intensely black. And they're kind of environmentally scaled at like 44 by 55 inches. The physical reality of them is a world shaped by blackness, as De Carafa would say, another photographer, now since deceased. But this image perhaps gives us other ways of unpacking site, notions of place, and the layered histories they and the people who moved through them were shaped by them carry, plus giving us material languages to do so with. How do we locate fugitive movements over land and latent histories of place? As Jerome mentioned, Dream the Combine recently completed a project in Columbus, Indiana, that aimed to investigate Columbus as both a network of places and as a metaphor. We researched 58 specific locales named for the Italian explorer, from Columbus, Indiana, the site of this installation, to Colombo, Sri Lanka. And in each of these places, we selected a specific narrative, and this text was overlaid onto these flagpole-like images without their props. We aim to overwrite the associations of Columbus with new stories from Indigenous, Black, and Latino voices, some of which were joyful, like the story of boogie woogie pioneer John Williams Boone from Columbia, Missouri, who said his music was the equivalent of, quote, putting the cookies on the lower shelf for all to enjoy. Or the story of Horace King, an enslaved architect, engineer, and accomplished builder who constructed a number of significant buildings and bridges in the South. He eventually bought his own freedom and went on to establish the King Brothers Bridge Company in Columbus, Georgia. Or other narratives, such as the tragic story of Ernest Collins, age 15, and Benny Mitchell, age 16, who were lynched at the Hanging Tree in Columbus, Texas, on November 12, 1935. Or the stories of Venezuelan cumbes near Puerto Colombia, or of the Man Simmons House owned by formerly enslaved Blacks in Columbia, South Carolina. There are so many stories of Black land as one of loss, triumph, tragedy, joy, and resistance. And we hope that the installation caused people to kind of, enter into dialogue through reading these stories and kind of shared experience and moving through the installation, and perhaps prompted them to see something familiar from another point of view. And then I think I'm nearing my end of my time, so I'm gonna put these up as a provocation maybe for later discussion, just to talk about two projects that have me thinking about Black land and how we construct home places, these kind of much more sort of intimate spaces. On the left is a work by a friend and Midwest artist, Jovan Speller, her installation in Lottie's living room, where here she is really piecing together the story of her family's land in Winston, North Carolina. At some point, an aunt or an uncle sold off the remainder of this acreage that had been put in her family for generations. And she wanted to make a work that was somehow in dialogue with this place. So it became a process of kind of reclaiming the loss of this trauma. And there's a really provocative interview that she gave about this piece where she's just in disbelief that someone would sell this property, saying, well, we labored here, people were born here, we died here, we're buried here. Why wasn't that enough for people to say that this land was worth something? And on the right is the Afrofuturist period room at the Met, the Metropolitan Museum in New York. which really, I think, pivots the question from maybe what was in the case of Jovan's installation and kind of what is, but to what should have been. So this is an installation kind of using a sort of Afrofuturist methodology to kind of reconstruct a narrative of what would have transpired had the neighborhood of Seneca Village been left to thrive instead of being razed for the making of Central Park. So the last image here I'll show is that much of our work has to do with unpacking underlying frameworks, unsettling things which are seen as foundational and taken for granted. Ultimately, I think we're continually unpacking boundary as a false narrative, that we can find some other forms of infinity, and also affirm the agency of Black people to mark and claim the space in which we are situated.
Wonderful, wonderful. I think, is it Marie up next? You're up.
Awesome. Yeah, about to show my screen here. Are you all able to see that? Great, great. So just jumping in here, I always like to, when I think this sort of consortium that we're creating, I think is raising so many timely issues about, that I think are kind of proposing emergent strategies to practice that kind of collapse issues of race and then power, but also like the production of culture and the sponsorship of agency and imagination. And this concern is super personal for me, just not only just as a Black person, but even just my upbringing and the closeness to land. So I actually grew up near my family's farm on my mom's side of the family. Most of her dad's side of the family were farmers. And so the photo on the image on the left is a satellite image of about 100 acres of farmland that has been in my mom's side of the family's possession for about 100 years at least, that I've been able to find. And so the photo on the right is me feeding the chickens with my great uncle. But I show you these photos because I feel like they kind of illustrate just how important land ownership is. I think for anyone, but I think especially for Black folks in the wake of a kind of mass dispossession of land, and also the kind of subjectivity that land ownership offers. And so, there's so many anecdotes that kind of come to mind when I see this photo, like this same uncle lifting me up into the trees to pick peaches and plums, and so that kind of, I think, closeness to, that kind of proximity to land, I think, kind of superimposed over Black existence, I think is just like a super, I think, a generative way of, has become a kind of super generative sort of inspiration for me for my current approaches to work and practice and pedagogy. I left Farmville sort of bittersweetly to attend Howard University. Oops. There we go. Howard University, of course, is a predominantly historically Black university in the heart of DC. And while it is certainly a different kind of place, it's in the heart of a major metropolis. That metropolis being, also the sort of nexus of a global power. And yet Howard and the Prospect, Virginia, are both kind of constituting what I consider Black landscapes, right? So these places that Black folks are, that are built for and by Black folks, that kind of engender a sense of agency, where Black folks can occupy space unapologetically and on their own terms. And I think when one is allowed to do that, or when a marginalized identity cultural group is allowed to do that, what then can be, what else can be produced, when you're not necessarily on the day-to-day basis, sort of responding to or reacting to conditions of whiteness, and when that energy can be more constructively and more generatively put towards the production of culture, sort of in a way that's kind of unconcerned with whiteness. So I have, in the more recent years, I've started to kind of link these two very formative chapters of my life, right? Like my sort of teenage years, or late teen and early 20 years, but also my childhood years, in this kind of context of the Black landscape. And yeah, so, you know, I think more recently I've been thinking about like how to engage this topic of Black land and what lessons can be offered from the occupation of land by Black folks, and the sort of subjective tropes of occupation of land that kind of can offer, I think, really healthy lessons for that kind of complement, or I'm sorry, that can critique traditional modes of practice, especially in the Western tradition. So I'll just show a couple of case studies here from my studio, Wayside. This was Diaspora. It was a one-day activation for a parking day in DC, which sort of acted like a 30-foot long infographic, which described the history, the population of Black folks in the city since the city's founding, since in 1790. And DC was actually the first chocolate city. It was the first predominantly Black major American city, and achieved it peaked at like 74%, I believe, in the 70s, and has been on a steady decline ever since. And that has been paired with juxtaposed with a steady increase in the white population in the city, and actually for the first time in several decades, the Black population in DC fell below 50%. So it's now become a sort of Black plurality. This project, again, acting as a sort of mapping of both the population and various historical occurrences throughout the city's history, used plants to kind of help to visualize that trend. And so we invited community members for a day to take these plants home and try to simulate the movement of people, which we were considering a sort of regional diaspora, the forced migration of Black folks into surrounding areas of Maryland and Virginia. So just kind of thinking about ways of like putting kind of more embodied sort of provocations to kind of start to image fraught and kind of complicated histories, but also kind of borrowing inspiration and lessons from Black occupations of land. More recently, I have been sort of embarking on this research project, sort of an ongoing research project called Dry Long Sew. It started off as a kind of got some funding from the Washington Project for the Arts, and then sort of manifested in a solo gallery installation. This iteration being called Dry Long Sew, an ode to the Southern Black landscape. It basically was sort of a listening room, right? I just had called home to several members of my family on the family farm in Virginia, and just talked to them on the phone about what land meant for them, what it meant to grow up near the farm, what kinds of lessons that offered, and put those phone conversations on cassette tape, and just kind of invited folks to sit around this 20-something foot long table and just listen to what I feel are certainly under recognized, but frankly customary ways that Black folks care for space, care for land, care for people. And so, I think also thinking about this as thinking about oral history as an emergent, maybe representational tool for how we describe built and lived space. And then as that kind of starts to color pedagogy, just thinking about like how do we pluralize the canon and beyond ways that we've been taught sort of in school, and looking to subjectivity. In my case, my entry point is typically Black subjectivity, subjective means of occupying land. This photo on the left is actually a Marshallese seafaring device, but the photo on the right is a Gordon Parks image of just Black joy that's kind of playing out in the street in Harlem. And I've just been kind of playing with different ways to bring that into the course, into the classroom. These two courses, Subjective Landscapes and Subjective Waters, are both taking inspiration from Black tropes of gathering to kind of arrive at sort of emergent strategies for how we can rethink program, how we can think about new kind of collaborative ways of working that sort of discourage individual ego and single authorship and celebrate informality and ancestral knowledge and memory. So these are sort of the thoughts that are floating around in my head these days, and sort of my entry point for how we might talk about Blackness and land. So thank you.
Amazing. All right, we've got to bring it home. Emanuel, save the best for last.
Yeah, that's all three of those are impossible to follow, but I'll try to add a few fragments to the conversation. All right, can you guys see that? Yeah, okay. So yeah, I'll just start by saying, first of all, I think, I do this work in order to be in conversation with people, and it's just amazing to be here in conversation with these three brilliant people, and to just kind of think further about a lot of these more difficult questions that really kind of require a lot of unlearning, just as much as they require learning and imagining. My name is Emanuel Admassu, and for the past 3 semesters, I've really been trying to ask a set of questions through a series of studios I've been teaching. And the first one is kind of an all Zoom studio that I taught at the GSD in fall 2020 called After Property. It was kind of 7 weeks of experimentation, thinking about the imaging of property. And that was followed by a full semester studio, again on Zoom at RISD called After Property Volume 2. And this past semester, an in-person studio in the urban design program at Columbia GSAPP called Atlanta After Property. And all 3 of these studios were really framed around a central question, which Jerome mentioned, and I think it was mentioned in the intro as well. How can we disentangle architecture and urban design from property? And these studios really aimed to amplify temporal slippages and spatial practices that carve out moments of liberation from the limits of property. And most of the studio participants were basically experimenting with ways of seeing beyond the privatized enclosure. And a lot of this is really trying to imagine a world or a way of being that is not tethered to ownership. And this work continues to develop by basically recognizing, drawing, and modeling ordinary spatial practices that operate against the hegemony of real estate speculation. In a way, how do we value systems and tactics that value people over property? In my practice ADWO, we've also been thinking about these questions, and a lot of the work similar to the studios really starts by reinterpreting historical and contemporary interventions where the everyday struggle begins to enter the realm of the sublime or the surreal. And we have been looking at, for example, ephemeral events like Freaknik that basically transform highways and streets from spaces that typically cut Black people off from the city into sites of Black joy and celebration. And how these kind of ephemeral spatial practices should really redefine or chart the future of architecture. For those of you who don't know, Freaknik is basically a yearly event where students from various HBCUs used to go to Atlanta for a picnic, which eventually became this kind of street party. I think a lot of my interest is also trying to think of ways in which we can think beyond the rubrics of the nation state and really think about global Blackness and think about the relationship that Black people have with land, not only in the United States, but also on the continent and elsewhere in the diaspora. So a lot of the work that we've been doing, researching urban marketplaces in East Africa, has been really trying to examine the ways in which people anchor themselves to land and how that space becomes a space of exchange, but also a space of self-fashioning. So the relationship between Blackness and land is always iterative. It's never static, and it's not necessarily caught up in settler colonial or Eurocentric notions of permanence. And I think the temporality is maybe the link that unites the four of our practices, because I think these temporal spatial practices really help us transform these boundaries that have been established through property into porous zones for various forms of self-fashioning. And this way of thinking was also very much in line with the work we produced for the Reconstructions exhibition called Immeasurability, where in this case, we were really thinking about spatial practices, again, that travel above, below, and beyond the kind of constraints and measuring strategies of architecture as a discipline. And we were trying to look at these everyday spaces in and around Metro Atlanta, where people are basically forming new ways of occupying land, and how we can come up with material strategies and imaging strategies to really further elaborate and articulate these questions. I also think it's not necessarily only about these everyday spaces, but also reconceptualizing the forest itself, especially within the context of Atlanta. And following Sylvia Winter, one could say it is really a space that is tethered between the plot and the plantation. And it is a space that is somewhere between freedom and enclosure and fugitivity and captivity. So immeasurability was really this prototype for an ongoing experiment and finding ways to translate these ideas into material form. But it's also looking at or maybe meditating on questions of legibility. And how do we think about legibility if it's not necessarily always going to be predicated on increased vulnerability, especially for racialized people. So in other words, these are forms, flows, and fluctuations in legibility that could amplify people's potential, especially Black people's potential to thrive in the city. And how can we imagine conditions that basically reintroduce people that have been displaced from the city and liberate spaces that have been imprisoned by property? And I would say these are, in a lot of ways, pedagogical exercises. They're also experiments and they're projects that we're producing in the practice. And all of them are frameworks for the production of alternative futures, free from alienation and dispossession. But they're also fortifying our commitment to a livable planet. And finally, I'll just end by saying that I believe the contemporary regime of property basically demonstrates a collective crisis in imagination. It's an unwillingness to devise other ways of relating to one another beyond the false promise of individuation. And I would say a careful meditation on Blackness and land tenure really demonstrates a refusal to contribute to a world where arbitrary values are ascribed to both land and people. And it's also predicated on a willingness to really live with difference and care. And this vision is always supported by quotidian practices that are simultaneously generous and uncompromising. And these are practices that help us build a world after property. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
What a perfect footnote or bookend, Emanuel. Thank you. And I know, you know, we could talk for 5 more hours. We might have a little bit of time here to take some questions, or if any of the 3 of you wanna kind of comment on what you saw. I think, Emanuel, you sort of, I think you ended so well with bringing it back home to this idea of, you know, we might be starting with Blackness, and also I think what links the 4 of us when we talk about pedagogy also is this kind of intense engagement with history, maybe in different ways, especially in the context of this sort of backlash of understanding history and a nuanced understanding of racialized history in the United States. So I think that's really interesting, but starting there, but ending at collective liberation as something that's kind of at stake, both in practice and of course in teaching. I just thought that was so great. And then Jennifer and Curry also thinking about, and Emanuel thinking about these stories at a global scale or at a continental scale. I think that's also something that's really interesting that's coming up, and that's coming up also in the work of many others, Mario Gooden, Mitch McEwen, other people, and these temporal spatial practices. And then, you know, again, like thinking about Blackness, but then thinking about Black landedness. You know, they're kind of 2 different things that we're oscillating around. But I want to give you guys a chance to give some more comments too.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to consider. I mean, I was writing like various notes on all the presentations, but I think certainly in the context of like architectural practice, like we're all practitioners in addition to educators, right? Like we're trying to find these sort of like, I think Emanuel, you called it strategies for articulation, right? And I think it's really interesting to think about that in the context of like articulate for whom, like who is this audience, like who is this, you know, who are we trying to reach with that? And then also, you know, does it take a form and shape that, you know, is about retreat, is about opacity, is about like illegibility, right? That there's a kind of way in which these, I mean, I really struggled with like what to say in this talk because I feel like it's such a vast topic. There's so many different ways in which you could talk about it. It's like, do I talk about capital and like labor in a specific way? Do I talk about you know, the intimacy of environment and this kind of embodied experience? And Curry, I love the picture of you, you know, as a little kid, because it made me think about like, yeah, like eating the pecans that would fall from my grandmother's tree in Montgomery, Alabama, you know? Is it about like networked space? Like, yeah, thinking on a much more kind of planetary scale. Like there's so many different ways in which we could talk about this. That try and like root it somewhere. But I think maybe that the fact that it's like out of our grasp is actually like part of the conversation too. So I don't know. There's not really a question in there, but I guess it's something about like, what are your thoughts on articulateness versus illegibility when we talk about Black land and audience?
Yeah, I'll just jump in and quickly say, I mean, I love the fact that you started your presentation with the Dawood Bey image, because I think, you know, at least for me, that is what I think is at stake for all of us, because we need to find ways to be legible with clear political agenda. And I think legibility, at least in the Modernist Project, is always assumed as an ambition towards universality. And I think there needs to be a version of legibility that is hyper-specific to these asymmetries that have been constructed over time, and how the images that we're producing, the objects that we're producing, I think all four of us are making things, and all of it is trying to at least play with various notions of legibility. And I love the fact that you said, you know, he had to lighten it in order for those images to circulate. And I don't know what that means in the realm of a spatial practice in the context of architecture. How can you begin to calibrate space so it becomes legible to folks who have been excluded from access to those environments?
Yeah, I think the thing that I always struggle with is like, where that work finds its root, right? Like most of our work is, you know, we do mainly most of our work in public space, but often it's like, you know, commissioned by a city, or it's commissioned by a museum or a gallery or something like that. So I think it also gets complicated when you start to think about like, who are the publics that are actually in the things that you are making. Curry, that's why I really loved your garden project, right? Where you said, okay, I'm doing a regional diaspora where the plants actually start to move out into the community, and there's a certain kind of seeding that happens, like of actual material. I thought that was really beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, well, thank you. That was a fun project. I would love to, that actually kind of sort of like inspired, I guess, the Dry Long Soap project, because I think the fact that it was live and that it was like literally generative and wasn't it was kind of liberated from a kind of fixed location. I think for me, I'm just like, that got me thinking about, okay, what are other kind of embodied ways of imaging subjective landscapes? And I mean, I think to your previous, you know, comment about there's so many different directions, you know, but I think that is a question that is, to me, more beckoning than disqualifying, I guess, because I feel like that we need all of those narratives, and we need to be cross-pollinating all those narratives. I think that's why the Academy is particularly important, and the work that we're all doing in the Academy, because, you know, I think if we're bringing these sort of subjective and embodied modes of practice and of learning and of working, then the publics that you're mentioning, we are kind of, you know, folks like us are kind of seeding, you know, and pluralizing kind of entrenched canons, entrenched nomenclature, entrenched practice, like that. You know, I think that's where the Academy, I should say, has a lot of potential. I mean, I think that's also why the public realm to me is also is so fascinating, because it is such a loaded condition. You know, Jerome and I discussed last year in our future practice class about how the public realm is often both the site of aggression and the aggressor, but at the same time, it's like kind of ripe with opportunity, and so I think we just kind of, you know, I think the challenge for us is like grappling with that and continuing to acknowledge that these problems, the issues that we're facing are very thick, and are very layered. And so that kind of requires an array of thickened and layered strategies for legitimizing and imaging under prioritized sort of narratives.
So Jerome and all, I think it might be time to take some questions from the audience. I know there are a couple of people interested in chatting with you and raising questions with you. I'm suggesting people either use the chat or to pose questions, or just use the raise hand function, and your real hand is fine, rather than the graphic. So
I like real hands and people turn their cameras on.
And the sea of names. It's like your project, Jennifer.
Ben, where
Oh.
are you? You said you had a question.
Did I just get called out?
Ben, okay, great.
Oh, man. Hey everybody, I'm coming from the Bay Area, Richmond by way of Oakland, by way of LA, kind of all over the place, but right now I'm in Richmond, California. Thank you very much. This is very interesting, very exciting. I have kind of a messy, multi-tiered question that I'll try to get down to the essence of. It's basically a question about the relative merits and demerits of sort of more antagonistic strategies versus more assimilationist strategies, particularly in thinking about recent movement around picking back up Pan-African projects. And so I guess what is my question? I'm curious about this kind of like perpetual conflict with Blackness in America, about the difference between gainful participation in American empire and like carving out comfortable spaces for ourselves here and now for our life cycles, for our lifetimes, which, you know, I'd like to be a little bit comfortable, I'm not gonna lie. And reconciling that with the reality that any benefits that we're extracting and any places that we're creating and any sanctuary that we're able to reproduce is in part implicated in this like anti-Black externality that's hitting, you know, if there's 43 million Black Americans, there's 99 million other Black folks in the diaspora outside of the US and outside of Africa, and then upwards of 1 billion folks on the continent. So it's kind of, I guess, a question about the scale of architecture and kind of a question about which Black folks were legible and legitimate towards. Man, that's not a clear question.
So maybe I thank you, Ben, so much. I think we hear some of what's coming through. I don't know if I have a fully formed response to all of it, but I think within there is also a little bit of a question about, you know, revolution or radical social transformation, right? And I don't have an answer, but I do think in this question of comfort, I think Emanuel touched on it in his slides, and Curry as well, in that what we are suffering from, and we all are suffering from, is a profound lack of imagination, right? And so I don't think that it's necessarily an either or, comfort or revolution. And when we talk about changing a relationship to one another that Emanuel brought up, but also to the land itself, there's other kinds of comforts that can be produced. So I don't think we're necessarily faced with this choice of assimilation and comfort versus revolution and discomfort. But I'll let the others comment.
Yeah, I mean, I really like Jerome's response, but I also really like your question and the fact that at least I heard it as, you know, as a Black person by participating in the American empire. How am I contributing to various forms of racial capitalism? And I think that's fundamental. I mean, I think that's a question that all of us have to ask ourselves. And I personally would.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I mean, especially as architects, I mean,
yeah,
like, yeah. In what context are we not a part of that?
Yeah, exactly. But I would say my response to your question is, I think it's a temporal strategy where every time, I think we have to always position ourselves against, obviously against racial capitalism. And there is always the acceptance of the fact that racial capitalism will always absorb the things that seem to be against it. And at that point, we have to completely recalibrate and imagine new strategies. So I think as long as we are operating through a temporal lens and we understand these things as rehearsals, then it becomes, at least for me, a little bit more liberating and less daunting, you know, because our participation in it is undeniable. And what I like about your question is the fact that it doesn't, basically forces us to deal with our own positionality. And I think sometimes in these conversations, we tend to pretend as if we're removed from the mess, but we're completely embedded in the swamp. So finding ways to basically navigate that, I think, is what we have to do.
If I may interject here, I'd like to read a question from a second-year student in architecture at Spitzer who's in the auditorium, not online. And so we have this weird, but it follows very nicely to the question Ben posed in the discussion. Such apologies for interrupting here, but I want to be sure his voice is heard. So hi, my name is Mo. I'm a second-year student. Can you speak a bit on Black ownership, how we can radicalize a collective ownership to something more tangible, maybe not of capital or of adjacent mirror of whiteness, but a collective ownership through a history of exploited labor pain and general condition of suffering? It's a very pointed question, I think, and it builds on some of the issues that the previous person was raising. Can you read it in the chat as well? Can you see it in the chat? Okay, great. All right, thanks. I just want to make sure we're all sharing in the dialogue, and I must say we're navigating this system of multiple formats here. So I appreciate your patience.
I mean, I think that's a great question and something that I think I've been thinking about myself. But I think as really all three of you all have been talking about, certainly Emanuel in your coursework, I think starting on like recalibrating the words that we're using, right? So what is ownership? What does ownership actually mean and look like for Black folks, right? Is it a photo? And I love that you're already kind of disclaiming in the question that like you don't mean like that we're striving towards a kind of photo negative of white frameworks of conquest and ownership, but maybe there's something else, right? And so I think that's why we do have to kind of start looking more closely at subjective sites of production, right? And kind of liberating ourselves from just very hard lines that we see, say, for instance, in the built environment, like between indoor and outdoor, private and public. Like all of those things need to kind of come into question. And we just frankly just need to be in the business of expanding and refusing the nomenclature that we use to describe how we occupy and how we qualify and quantify land. Like all of that needs to just kind of be called into question, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I would just also add to that, you know, in maybe more micro instances, that's happening all over the place all the time. So there's many instances of radically reimagined care and ownership, usually women-led, I would say, in smaller instances happening all over all the time. So it's part of, I think, to Curry's earlier point, kind of bringing in these other canons, other terms or forms of being.
Yeah, and just promoting what's already been created, right? Because you know, I think there are already existing and healthy frameworks of kind of collective ownership, if I can quote your question, right? the audio that I was getting for instance, the Dry Long Sew project, I think was a great sort of survey of that. These 9 Black women in my family that who were teachers and mothers and sisters and farmers and artists, like there was a kind of milieu that was constituted there on that land of a kind of collective and subjective ownership, right? That was subjective and sort of ancestral, right, in nature, but it was still operating alongside traditional kind of colonial definitions of ownership. So I think it's going to be it's entangled, but I think there are also existing kind of precedents for how we might kind of move forward to a more gracious practice.
Yeah, I mean, when you showed that image, Curry, of you and your uncle on the farm, that's precisely what I was thinking. Like, basically, what forms of relation existed on that farm through generations. And I think that's precisely the type of conversation we need to be having around land and Blackness. And I will also say, I think some of these forms of relating to one another might not be scalable. It might have to remain at the scale of a home. And I think that's fine. I would actually think that's probably the best thing that could happen. And similarly for me, I've been thinking about compound houses on the continent and the types of relations that exist, the types of kinship that exist in compound houses throughout the continent of Africa and elsewhere. And that's not based on, this Cartesian kind of bordering practice that we have here. And I think that will help us imagine differently.
I think that's right. I mean, I feel like growing up in Southern public education, Southern Virginia public education, like you're almost kind of led to think that cities, towns look like New York and the suburbs of Chicagoland areas and the outskirts of Atlanta, when in fact most of the world lives in cities that look like Lagos and Sao Paulo. And so, those frameworks, that kind of trope from the continent that you just mentioned, I think like that's already kind of indicative of like how most of the people in the world are living. So like, how do we just take inspiration from what we already have?
Jerome, you want to read this long one?
Yeah, sure. I'll read it so that my colleagues could answer it. So I think it was Kristen texted me or messaged me this. Yes, this is from Kristen. Who? Hi, Kristen. So Kristen is asking about what might you see, how shifts in architecture, landscape architecture and planning connect with current movements in food justice and Black urban rural farming, such as recent aspirations towards city level reparations, land back movements. Is this communication across disciplines where legibility is important? Or might the idea of fugitivity or subversiveness lend more to a more decentralized, informal conversation? Yes. But do you three have any thoughts on that? A great question, Kristen.
Yeah, I'm still formulating a thought here, but I also just kind of appreciate the question because in my mind, it kind of acknowledges that they're not as present in the discipline as they could be. And I've been saying probably since undergrad that I'm kind of skeptical of, in particular, of the architecture discipline and its ability and facility to grapple with or even just pay attention to and kind of be relevant and be hip, right, to these kind of Blacker grassroots efforts towards agency and justice and liberation. So yeah, I guess I just appreciate the question on those grounds alone, but I'm curious to see if anyone else has a
yeah. I mean, I think even when you think about working within the context of, say, dark matter university, I found that so much more, we're talking about built environment than just architecture, and a kind of essential interdisciplinarity in order to do things like dark matter U teach the fugitive practice course. There's like an inherent interdisciplinarity.
Yeah, I'll just add, I mean, I had a conversation with Lake and Sarah Zodi recently, and the third panelist was Sabi Horn, who's a lawyer, and she's basically working with Black farmers in the South, trying to make sure that they maintain ownership of the land. And I completely agree. I mean, I think you answered the question, but these are the conversations we should be having. You know, I would love to teach a studio with a lawyer to really think about new structures. And, you know, when we were doing this urban design studio last semester, first of all, I was teaching it with Nina Cook-John, Lexi Chen, and Chat Treviso, my collaborators. And almost all of the projects ended up becoming community land trusts, you know, and we know there are limits to that model as well. And I feel like sometimes we're looking for the silver bullet, and we're not letting ourselves kind of move past that initial kind of reaction to the question, and maybe kind of, I don't know, like, for example, to me, what Cameron Rowland is doing with questions of property is much more radical than something like a community land trust, right? Mm-hmm. So I feel like, yeah, it just needs to be much more fundamental. But going across these disciplines and really speaking to lawyers and other folks who can really help us redefine architecture and urban design is really important.
Emanuel, I hope you tune in when Cameron speaks in this series. He's the last speaker, so perhaps.
What a great way to end the semester.
Yeah. Knock us with the punch, right? Brilliant artist, brilliant thinker, wonderful human being. Are there other questions? A number of people turned on their screens as soon as Jen asked for, sorry, Jennifer, pardon me, asked for faces, and I was hoping that many of you that you might have questions. I guess that's a resounding silence on Zoom, isn't it?
I just wanted to extend what Emanuel was saying about, yeah, I think that inherent in your question, Kristen, is that we need to be in increased dialogue with people outside of our discipline. I mean, Curry, I think when you speak about a kind of like skepticism or doubt, like, I mean, in a way, it's like it's sort of a failure, right? Right. So I think all of us have these practices that are sort of hybridized in some way because of the failure of the discipline. That we search outside, we move into different tactics, different territories. You know, working in a particular vein to be able to say the things that you want to say. So I'm not sure how it's going to come around, because there is a way in which like the actual practice of architecture leads you to very sort of facile answers if you're operating within the kind of, you know, capitalist flow, right? To go back to Ben's question. So I think each of us have very intentionally like crafted practices where we're like 1 foot in, 1 foot out, and hybridizing to try and like extend the edges of what architecture is.
Yeah, but I think also like just acknowledging that there's necessary discomfort in that process. And Jerome and I were just talking about that the other day for fugitive practice, you know, as we were like developing an assignment, and just like, is, you know, what, like, I think so much in these sort of strategies or these efforts to kind of crack open the discipline in constructive ways are going to involve you're going to have to cede power. You're going to have to cede power, and you have to cede, and at least in the short term, you might have to cede some comfort, because that if we acknowledge that things can't go on, but we also acknowledge that we may have to kind of work within the framework, then you end up sort of like trying to build a new bike and fix the one that you're riding at the same time. And
yeah, correct. I think that's such a great way of putting it, Curry. You know, and even thinking about maybe flipping it so it's not even so much of, oh, what can this other so-called discipline do for architecture or do for me, but what can we offer also these other disciplinary spaces, which we can offer quite a lot. You know, a project that I'm working on right now that was at the end of my slides is restoring the Potomac, just a large kind of memorialization project in Appalachia, and you know, nonprofit leaders, historians, these sorts of folks, our disciplinarity has huge things to offer that work, but it's just slightly flipping the kind of that sort of orientation towards like, oh, what can I pull into architecture? Well, what can architecture generously also contribute to these other kind of